And your name is?
Damon Isiah Turner.
Okay, word up. Peace. I'm Justice. All right. So we'll just go.
All right.
Peace. This is the Ask Your Oldhead podcast with Justice Rajee. I am joined by my guest, Damon Isiah Turner. Peace, Damon.
Peace, Justice. How are you today?
I'm good. So this is a return appearance for Damon. And I actually asked you on today so we could talk about politics, of all things. Because you're someone that I know is, I'd like to say that some people are involved in politics, some people are engaged in politics, and some people do a lot of talking about politics. And you strike me as more of the first two, and then the talking just because, you have stuff to say, but, that's not necessarily, you're more about the involvement and the engagement. And I thought with our current times and the approaching next year, that it would be a good time to have a conversation about these things. So maybe just to ease in, how would you define being politically or engaged in politics? Like, what would be something that how would you define that for people?
I think that we've always lived in, it's always, I think, been important for people to be aware of what's going on around them at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. I always think about how there were impacts on my parents' generation, who were baby boomers, and things that they were aware of, and they might not necessarily have been really active, current or news people, but there was so much going on that impacted their daily lives around the latter tail end of the civil rights movement, that they were just aware of what was going on. They were aware of so many of the actors, whether it was civil rights leaders or community leaders or federal actors, whether it was Lyndon Johnson or whomever else at the federal level. They were just aware of those kinds of things. And so even now, sometimes my mom will reference certain things from that era, or my dad will when I'm with them. But I think that, so I just say that to say, I think every era it was important, but I particularly think it's really important now, regardless of your professional background, of whether you're a longshoreman or a rail worker, or you go to an office every day. If you're a consultant, we're sitting in a consultant's office right now as we do this, as we have this conversation. Whether you work for federal government, nonprofit, private industry, it is just really important to be aware at a basic level of how other people make decisions that impact you. There's a lot of people who are unaware of how things impact you, impact your taxes, impact issues around housing that happen around you, issues around rural development, urban development, whether you're come from a rural community where ranching or farming is extremely important. Whether it's transit issues. And on a national level, a lot of people are tangentially aware of some of the issues around our current president over the last few years. But I think paying a lot of attention is important. You don't even have to be engaged on a organizational level, but just being aware. I mean, whether it's read, and I would just really advocate for anyone, read a bit of local news and have one be the primary institutional paper in your area, one of an alternative independent source. Do the same for state and for federal. Choose from a wide variety of places, and not just television media, not just the top three, not just CNN or Fox or MSNBC. dig in the weeds on from the Washington Post or New York Times or some other credible news source. Mm-hmm. I was somewhere the other day where we were talking about a lot of people get their news off of Facebook, and there's a lot of news on Facebook that's not credible. It doesn't come from credible sources. If you're international news, BBC is great. There's a lot of other sources, but just choose at the very least one source. And if you're a person and even if you're not from a particular social group identity or community of color, re-identify at least one source that you can glean information from, because a lot of independent media and a lot of news happens in a lot of places. So it's the connection from politics to me is really about being connected to current events in a historical framework, and how it affects things economically and politically. So that's a place to start. You don't and that's even before the conversation around how you get involed. Okay. That's just a basic start. I'm saying everyone should be at that place. Okay.
Yeah, and that's something I think, because I find when I'm either talking to people about, politics, it either goes fast to the like voting or not voting and this or not that. And I'm always concerned with, I end up sometimes playing the like, film like, did you see what happened? And they're like, and they're really uptight, right? And so then I turn into question man, and I do it from at least with people I have a relationship with, from the perspective of, I want to make sure if your blood pressure is going up, that your blood pressure is going up for a good reason, and not just because like of the shock value of something that you heard. Like, well, what other things did you hear? Where did you read it at? Who was saying it? Oh, for real? What thing did they say? In what state? In this state? To kind of figure out if whatever piece of information that you received that, got you going is actually from a credible source, or makes sense if you start talking about what it is. They're like, they said they're going to take all the cows away. And you're like, all the cows? Like, wait a minute, hold on. Who's taking the cows? Where are they going?
But that's happening.
Yeah, but that
is really happening, whether it's an urban community, or a rural community. That it could happen that easily. Somebody could start some kind of rumor, and it can go on. So it just have a life of its own. Yeah. But that's at the core of it to me. Credibility. Mm-hmm. There's an organization I'm involved with called Healthy Democracy that's based out of Oregon. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but where they do these. One of their programming is around. Citizen Initiative Reviews, or CIRs, where they bring together from different communities, and they do it statewide in different states that have ballot initiatives, and they've even done some internationally. So a state ballot initiative is usually a particular issue, a very limited issue, and what they do is they bring together about 20 voters in a 4-day process, in a democratic process, and bring in outside experts and people that are on the pro and con side of the issue, and then people in the room also have the ability to bring in information, and then they provide a statement that goes in the voters pamphlet that includes both the pro and the con and objective information. But every piece of information on that one pager that goes out to all of the voters has to be verifiable. Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean about the kind of example you gave about the cows. If it's not verifiable and credible, then stay out of my way. Yeah. Or go on with that. Yes, that's my value system.
Yeah. And I think like that, in that being a beginning point of just having that awareness of like what's going on, and then would you say that the bridge is from I'm aware of some of the issues, maybe the ones that maybe stand up for me, either due to what I do for a living or due to my social situation or whatever, then maybe those become your entrance into involvement, I would think. Right. Like if you're concerned about schools, you might, you might that
entree because you're caring about how things impact your young people, your kids as well as the other young people in your community. Yeah. Or it might be transportation if you ride a bike a lot. Yeah. It might be criminal justice or public safety, because that tends to impact most people until, or even the people who don't think it impacts them until it impacts them.
Right. It didn't matter until it mattered a whole lot.
Yeah. So it depends on the issue, housing, but yeah. And I think wherever that entryway is for you.
So, I mean, we could either jump into the pool on the big issue that's happening right now, or I'll roll it out soft and you can swing as hard as you want. What do you think is just something that's happening at the moment that people really need to dig into the weeds a little bit on it in terms of either political issue, either locally, nationally, maybe not necessarily, just something that's happening that's like people need to go read the details?
Well, the most obvious one is as we record this, we're in the midst of the possibility of an impeachment inquiry of the president by the House of Representatives. Paperwork hasn't been filed yet, from my understanding, as of today. But that's the kind of the most topical issue. But I think before we delve into that or anything else, one of the things that's just really unfortunate about this is that there are so many issues we are not dealing with because we have been so consumed by the drama and politics of the last 3 years. And some would even say 8 years before that, and 8 years before that, and 8 years before that. So I'm going back to the very least 92, when Bill Clinton was elected. But there's so many issues we're not addressing right now as a result. The fact that foreign governments were involved technologically in our voting systems, and how there was messaging, and maybe even at the state level in regards to voting, is something that doesn't just go away because we're more caught up in the politics of what wasn't accurate, or some people think what was not accurate, or came to any conclusions in the Mueller report, or the issues with Ukraine and that kind of a thing. Every time this kind of stuff happens, what ends up, what's really unfortunate is that while we should be paying attention to it, and I'm not in any way saying we shouldn't, but what I'm saying is our potential and capacity as a nation, as a society, to solve some of our problems aren't getting done. We're not passing any kind of legislation, or we're not showing how, or we're not even shoring up our technological defenses against these kind of it's really terrorism, with this kind of terrorism, or we're not solving the big problems around climate change, around economic stability, around housing en masse. And so what ends up happening, we're not doing it on a large scale, and so what ends up happening is that more of the onus is on local communities, states, cities, to address local issues, which they already already be doing historically. So that itself is a good thing. But there's not a larger message around, how are we connecting with each other in different communities around these issues to work together. Yeah. It's over here. California's doing their thing here. Oregon is doing their thing here. North Carolina is doing their thing down here. But there's not this larger impetus around what we should be doing as a nation. Yeah. That's the big loss for us. And there's a lot of air that's been being taken out of the room by focusing on so much so on these events that it consumes everything, and we're not getting anything done.
Yeah. So if we could, even as an exercise, just stuff that is a serious concern for the future of our communities, that I can't recall if in the I turned 18 in what year is this? This is 2019. I turned 18 in roughly, was it 2000? Oh, not 2000. Long time ago, like 1996, somewhere around in there. No, I turned 20, so 1994. So in the years since I've been able to vote and have voted in things and voted for congressmen and other things,
that was a contract with America.
Oh yeah, I remember that, the contract.
Or on America, I forget which one it was.
Well, it was the contract with America, but in some ways it felt like the latter.
It was Newt Gingrich.
I can't say that there's been a comprehensive commitment to repairing our infrastructure.
Exactly, which is a bipartisan
that doesn't care about anybody's political positions.
Exactly,
the roads, the bridges, it's always similar. It's almost a weird feeling I get every time anyone brings up Flint, because they will talk about Flint like it's this person or that person or these people haven't fixed this or that, but it's like Flint's not fixed because no one wants to fix anyone's infrastructure.
Right.
Newark just had a whole thing this summer. Mm-hmm. Pittsburgh has had multiple things at the same time. Stuff was going on with Flint. Cities all over, and not just little cities, big cities, little towns all over the country have infrastructure problems it's enough of a vital need that the federal government should have a play or a role in it. And
historically, though, at least, for example, with the building of highways, historically, car companies had a lot to do with that. Mm-hmm. So there has always been this relationship between the public and private sector on some of these issues. I think we got a little more proactive in terms of the values around the intersection of multi-parties coming together on the private enterprise, nonprofit sector, and government sector on solving local issues around the late 90s and early 2000s with a lot of the private public enterprise and partnerships, but we're not hearing about that as much. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these things are framed in the context of, well, do we even have the money to do that kind of thing? Federal infrastructure, blah, blah, blah. Because people were thinking about it in like Franklin Roosevelt days or something like that. But the reality is, like you said, federal government should be a partner, but not the sole entity. And that's where we are going wrong, because we're not have a lot of leadership that is able to engage all of those sectors to kind of marshal our proactive, forward-leaning stance on these issues. I mean, some mayors are, but you need kind of a national presence, or at least a large sense of credibility in your region, in your city, to be able to do that, in your state, and not everyone has that. Yeah. But we need that. That's a central element of leadership right now. Who can talk to the private sector and the government sector, and large scale foundations who may be willing to even partner. Okay, we'll chip in some to help on this bridge. Mm-hmm. All that kind of thing.
And stuff that is it's going to impact what the shape of your space looks like. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't mean that
livability.
It is not the only thing, but it is a big thing, and it's a thing that it would seem like, even if we don't agree about a vast number of other issues that might be a little bit more, tuned to your particular political position, that seems like something that should be kind of like, oh man, put that up on the map. We knocked that right out. Like, yeah, we need sewers that work. we need at least a means that if hundreds of thousands of people can't get access to clean water, that we could go, hey, we gotta come together to make this work. Right now, we know that there's other factors that make it okay for a state like Michigan to decide, yeah, it's cool if Flint's water gets a little, and not just Michigan, any state decides certain places' issues are not as important as other places' issues. We understand that there's many other layers to those issues, but I mean, in terms of immigration reform, is not. I mean, there's been no that's going on since the Reagan administration.
And they actually
had got some stuff done then,
right? Stuff that they would be anathema today for at least some members of Reagan's party. That's why I always find it funny when people who are like strong supporters of and you know, I lived in D.C. as a kid when Reagan was president. I'm showing my age, but some of the things that he did, he and then Speaker Tip O'Neill from Massachusetts came together on some stuff because they had a weekly whiskey drinking time. Every so often they would come together and they would just hammer out some stuff, chop it up on a social basis to connect. Like a lot of that stuff wouldn't even fly now. Like as much as as he's the standard bearer, a lot of stuff he actually was willing to compromise on wouldn't even be willing to fly now because people have staked out such extreme positions to speak to a constituency that honestly I'm not sure is the majority.
Right,
they're the loudest.
They're active.
Yeah, active, but I'm not sure it's the majority. So, I mean, what are we getting past right now?
I don't know.
So we raise the budget limit every year.
The budget limit every couple months, and what's another one? That transportation, which is sort of tied to infrastructure, but and I guess this is on my mind just because of there's so many other. I mean, you mentioned the auto industry's role in sort of certain parts of our infrastructure. I mean, and even the priority on cars over other modes of transit. It was definitely reflective of an industry that had sway and spoke to other issues of the time, of the 40s and 50s after the war. But in this age where a lot of people younger than us don't own cars, are not in a rush to own cars, unless they need one by utility, right?
But they are still utilizing cars through Uber and Lyft.
Right, they're still utilizing.
Because all of these folks aren't just on the train or bus or bike. That's the interesting part of it, the dynamic on it. They may not even ever have an interest in owning a car, but Uber and Lyft may be their friend.
Yeah, that may be their mean. What else? I mean, trade policy is a whole other thing, but
and there's so much potential there on who we could even expand to who we're trading with, industries and we're always if we truly believe in the potential for democracy, actual democracy, participatory democracy, we could be supporting other countries, underserved, underutilized countries in supporting their exports in ways that, I mean, there's a very important focus on China, but we could be supporting a lot of other places as well right now that we don't. This is the kind of thinking that I don't think that we're really doing as leaders. To open up industry, because that's really where it's at. Trade, country's ability to export what their talent, what they make, and and to benefit from it internally. Yeah.
I think about it because it becomes an issue. I mean, even again around like sort of what people are engaged in, and when I would speak about politics with folks, that they may not see how even their chosen profession has, political ramifications as to why that, or they, their area of work, because it may not even be what they want to do or what they're skilled at or what they've trained in, but something that they've had to do because of opportunity and access and other issues, either from the perspective of, folks who maybe are from overseas and got their engineers where they came from, and they would be an engineer here if we'd let them. But because of their, their certification doesn't transfer, this, they're doing this other thing. But then we have folks, folks from here, grew up here like me or you, whichever part of the country that was, I hear all the time, I went to college for this, but I'm doing this other thing over here, right? But there's political context to why maybe, the thing that you went to college to study or to do is not what you ended up, where you found yourself working. Is there something you could say around the way our current sort of climate impacts sort of like, work and opportunities, especially for Black people, that, that's been on your mind or you've wrestled with in some of your own work or experiences?
That's a vast question.
I do that one right
now. I gotta process that more. How about can you ask it again?
Yeah. Is there something from your experience that you could say that speaks to just how opportunity for employment or work sort of for Black people sometimes is affected by politics, or the political climate of an era? I think, like, for me, a simple historical answer or thought would be, and this maybe tie into what we were just talking about before we got to taping, the work that Black people could do here in the Pacific Northwest when they most really started to come here in larger numbers. The limitations on their ability to be productive were not based on their actual innate character or capacity. It was actually based on what the local government, whose rights they would protect. Meaning, if you were skilled and other things, but like, yeah, we only really want to see you as a porter, manual labor, domestic worker, right? So then, if I try to show up someplace else and people deny me, my civil rights to fairly be employed in that work, there will be no government, there will be no protective remedies for me. So therefore, I got to feed myself, I got to feed my family, so I'm going to take a job doing other things. Is one example I think about.
And in some communities, there's the underground economy has even historically supported as a secondary form of income that job.
Right. So you subsidize that with, running numbers or any various other great economy work. Because I was in North Carolina in the last 3 weeks, and one of the things that was striking traveling, I was on a panel, and then there with longtime friends, and then getting some history.
What was the name of the conference and what was the panel?
Oh, it was the Black Communities Conference, and the panel was the state of our communities, a conversation around Black communities involving multiple disciplines and areas, which that's not the exact name, but it's pretty close.
In Durham.
Okay. North Carolina. And the striking thing is that you, for whatever challenges Black people definitely had there was a level of economic stability and prosperity that some folks experienced, and even some ability to have really to dictate some terms around how you're treated, because you growing tobacco, you had a leverage, you had a point of leverage, right, that you could work certain ways, and then, like, a subsequent conversation I had with my mother when I got back, and she was like, yeah, because people from North Carolina sometimes, they got a different way about them. They kind of let you know, like, I'm from North Carolina, like, a little bit of like, hey, I'm out here, doing things. So I started, thinking about that behaviorally and how one would act, and being in a space where maybe you don't have that leverage, like this state, so you got to act differently.
Right.
You know what I mean? So, like, anything in there that comes to mind.
And you're not part of a like, I don't know about this. I think the state, North Carolina, might be 30-something% African American or Black. But like when you're in a community where you are clearly a minority population of people of color, even. So your capacity is partly impacted by that. I would never say completely, but in terms of like your the way that impacts you and your comfortability, your sense of connection, and your sense of collective power, unless it's intentional, can really fall by the wayside. Whereas with some other communities where there's larger numbers, it plays out differently. Sometimes there's more competition, but sometimes it's very much easier to work collectively on certain issues. But that just means that people who are in smaller or less populated communities in terms of who they identify with culturally and ethnically have a different model. That's all it means. And it's a different model to prosperity. That model is in a place like Des Moines. And I'm putting all these together because these are different sized cities, but in terms of people, populations of people of color, Des Moines to a Seattle to a Portland, to some other cities that maybe not always thought of as having a lot of people of color in them. Even, let's take Minneapolis, for example. Forget the name of I forget the number of the district, but it's who's the Congress Omar? Congresswoman Omar?
Yeah.
So you know who held that seat before her? It was Keith Ellison.
Okay.
Who was the first Muslim member of Congress. That seat is the only congressional seat owned by a Black or African American, or in her instance, African congressperson that is not majority Black. That seat is almost comparable to the 3rd district and as Earl Blumenauer's district in Oregon. It's around 70-something% white, around 30% people of color. And Minneapolis has had a long history of immigrant communities moving there and settling and becoming really active members of the society there. And so she is representative of that, or her family is representative of that. But that district is intriguing, and that's a model. So and so, like, to take Portland for example, it's majority white, and you have 30% people of color in this particular district. Of course, not in the city, but or somewhere around, like a variance of those numbers.
Yeah.
The model is different. The alliances are different. There needs to be a really enforced effort around alignment, around when we come together. Okay, it may not look like Wakanda, but it may look like La Raza meets Indigenous, meets Wakanda, meets working class whites, meets some Bernie whites, meets some Warren whites, some Buttigieg whites,
right?
Some Beto whites, and keep it going. It might include, and this is not anathema to say, but it might include some upper income whites as well, whose sentiments lie in these issues. Way. And so in terms of being anti-capitalist, I don't necessarily think is always the way to go. Say you're talking about social entrepreneurship, or talking about good business or B Corps, or that kind of thing, in the ways that we could change our society even from a capitalist lens, and doing good things. There's a lot of people doing good things. That needs to be more a part of the discussion about, or when you have all these alliances. And so in that way, and that model is the kind of model that tends to get people elected in Minneapolis. And they can coexist, and they can have friendly debate on their, the socialists can sit in the same room with the social entrepreneur, who's firmly committed to business, but good business. Yeah. So and so that's the kind of model that tends to happen in a place like Portland, Minneapolis, and so it's just. But part of our challenge, I think, our community is making sure that we aren't included in that table because in a leader in that room, because some of the time we can even get siphoned out when it's a POC.
Yeah, I feel you. Like our particular, maybe our needs on the platform could get washed out to the side, or at least maybe not
or
at
the very bottom. Yeah, exactly. Or at the very bottom, or washed out completely. Like
kind of like once we get all these other things done, we're gonna get to that thing y'all needed us to do. But please keep coming to the meetings.
Right. Exactly. So we have to ensure that.
Yeah.
Which is a very different dynamic than in Atlanta, Charlotte, as you know, Philly, Chicago. Right. It's a different dynamic. You know, it's usually. A lot of ways it's pitted against each other, but there are usually so many of us that there's camps, groups, and sometimes collectives where we're, you know, and especially around certain issues, we can convene and coalesce and around certain things.
Yeah. So let me know if this is true, because it's something I think he said in there that when you start talking about involvement, right, in kind of the political activity, is that it's going to gets into a actual like engagement with the people who are present. That the complexion or the shape of what the entity that is the best vehicle for your desires may not look or be one way, right? That it has to respond to the conditions of your space. Is that an accurate kind of capture that?
Mm-hmm.
And then
the model, there's not a one size fit all model,
right? So like what would be the way to get, you know, something across in South Central? It may not be the same political strategy that a community could take. I mean, definitely not in Portland, but even in, say,
which is becoming gentrified. Oh, I was just in the corner of Crenshaw in Slauson last week, seeing Marathon and the mural to Nipsey. They're building a huge subway up and down Crenshaw, or light rail system that's like, you know, it's shifting everywhere.
Yeah. Well, it's I mean, there's no piece of land is necessarily yours forever without some level of intention or action. You know, there has to be some purpose, some, you know, like I was listening to a podcast and reading something else about the history, a little bit about the Fillmore in San Francisco and how quickly the Fillmore transferred from a predominantly Japanese community to a black community. And it, you understand, it was like roughly in the span of 2 to 3 years. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, part of that was the horrendous nature of internment and other things. But once that happened, and then it was like the Fillmore, and it was no longer whatever the Fillmore was before then, but now that the Fillmore, you know, in our decade, in our time, has become this other thing. Go ahead.
I'll share a bit about that. I think that there's so much power in that, you know, whether it's I was reading this article. I went to grad school at Columbia, and I was reading this article because they're talking about the oral history project for Obama that's happening there, and it's in a really intense, like a lot of his papers, and there's a whole team that's working on, you know, the narratives around people who are interacted with all aspects of his presidency. So it's a really in-depth research experience. Academia and certain institutions like that who are really good at that. But, you know, this comes from, you know, the oral tradition of, you know, whether it's indigenous native communities, whether it's African communities, whether it's other communities who've done this historically over time. Mm-hmm. I think that's part of the key for new generation of political leadership. Mm-hmm. I've been spending some time in Wilmington, North Carolina recently. You're talking about the Fillmore, and so regardless of where that community is, you know, and as you know, there's a lot of policy and Portland now around people who have been displaced and their ability to return to home ownership in Northeast Portland. For any of those who are listening to this broadcast, which had historically been the center of the Black community in Portland, Oregon. So regardless if it's a Wilmington, Portland, you can really go to a lot of even smaller cities and identify a place. Whoever it is, they should have a strong sense of the power of the impact of that history on its city's residents to be a part of their narrative in what they want to do to impact change in that city. Like I know even in Wilmington, there's still an issue around Confederate soldiers still being honored. And there's a whole history about really essentially genocide, people being run out. At one time it was like Tulsa.
It was one of the most thriving places for Black people in America.
Right, exactly. And and some or with Latino communities, I mean, it's all this talk about invasion with the young man who shot those people in El Paso and utilizing the president's actual language in the manifesto that he left. Answer me this: how can you be an invader or invade a place which had previously been invaded and had been yours prior to 1848? California, Arizona, Texas, that was Mexico. These lands were owned by indigenous and Latino Mexican communities, which had been usurped in similar ways that a lot of African land had been usurped in the South and not given back post the Civil War. So these are things that people understanding these histories around where you live, around the impact. Now, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do at the city level and the county level? Or are you going to be able to have those conversations where are you going to be that proactive leader where maybe there had been a historical sense of competition between the county and the city where you live? No, be that person. That's the person who will say through the oral tradition of that narrative around in terms of your campaign around what can we do to make this better. If I'm running for city council, I want to work with the county commission. I want us to bridge our resources on certain issues around housing, for example, direct impact policies around this narrative. And that I think can speak to a lot of people, newer residents, people who are firmly connected to that history, whether it's in Northeast Portland or Wilmington. So, I'm bringing that for example, or of course, it might play out differently in a south side of Chicago where there's a lot of challenges going on right now. But the pluses are that there's so many individual and community-oriented wins that we're having right now, like the conference you went to. Like, there's a lot of stuff happening on the ground right now. So much. Yeah. And I just wish there was like a way that we had what we're doing with technology. I just wish there's a way that more people knew who may not necessarily be involved in it. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that, and I think actually, I know I want to respect your time. I think you bring us to a good spot there, because I think one of my biggest concerns and I think biggest interest is folks understanding that there's actually, if you start digging in the weeds, in most places, there's people that are trying to do different things to uplift their communities, to change the dynamics around their communities that we would maybe not mark as politics, but actually are a part of the broader narrative of what politics is really about. So
it's community organizing.
Yeah, it's orienting your values. Whom engage in private entities. Like, if you want to build, or if you have a factory in this neighborhood and hundreds of people in this neighborhood do great work that you use, that you take and you do what you do with your profits. Hey, we want to keep you in this neighborhood, in this community. You also need to be a good community partner.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like your workers live here.
Mm-hmm.
We like our work. You know,
Exactly.
we like working for you.
Exactly.
Also, though, you need to respect. Like, you know, we're in this together.
Exactly.
Like having those conversations, talking about the.
You talking Pittsburgh and Newark now.
Yeah, I mean, and that's in communities that these are. There's more than one channel to getting things done, and I think sometimes it can be easy to kind of on that non-credible news source level to read things that may lead you to believe it's all despair, it's all doom. And it's like, no, there's actually a lot going on.
A lot.
There's people fighting every day, and some of the fighting is trying to get me and you and the next man next to us to come to the meeting or at least to fill out the form or to keep an ear out for, you know, and to pay attention to things that are going on.
But this is the irony. We have so many mayors of color now.
Yeah.
I mean, and dynamic women mayors, enlightened white male mayors. I mean, and you know, supporting them and engaging them and knowing, and they're still doing the same kind of issues. You might have a young black mayor in Jackson, Mississippi.
Yeah,
young
I
black
want to
mayor
go down there.
There's some interesting dynamics there. A young black mayor in Stockton, California. The police chief still reports to them. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean all
they do.
Doesn't mean that everyone on the police force hasn't had any kind of negative interaction with the residents. So they're still dealing with these issues, but you know, but the way that they're able to deal with them, I think this is why it's important for people to be involved. This is the one thing I always want to say to people: the way that people can be involved doesn't have to be in a way that doesn't naturally fit who they are. Mm-hmm. The way you get involved, like you were saying, that person who may have been a parent and they start off on education issues because it speaks to their truth in their daily lives around their care for their kids and their youth around their community. Get involved in a way that maybe is naturally you. Say you're a graphic artist, maybe that's your entree. Mm-hmm. You know, it doesn't have to be canvassing. It could be the thing that, say you don't want to interact with that many people. Right. So you actually want to design stuff and for the people. Right. Do it.
Right. Right. The work needs a graphic designer.
Exactly. If it could be someone else who has another skill set or another talent, you know, around technology, you know, because we need good people with values who will resource technology in a way that benefits movements and campaigns and protects campaigns from being, to borrow a word I use that's used in another context, invaded by people who have ill intent. And that's what's happening. You know, it's around, we're seeing with campaigns with you know, there's some stuff has been, you know, by people with ill intent or really trying to do negative things, whether it's not just Russia.
Yeah. Well, that's folks have ambitions.
Yeah.
And they will, we don't live in it, and the world doesn't exist in a vacuum. And when, from a local level to a national level, I mean, a diminished U.S., for whatever it may mean, that's a possibility that opens the door for another country that has other ambitions to have a different influence that may or may not be beneficial for the people there or the people here or the people in between. Right. So like people are actively trying to advocate for their wish and their outcome. And I think we can sometimes think that it's almost benign, or we're encouraged, I would say, maybe better to say, encouraged to think, oh, well, people are just benignly kind of moving around, and there's people that are moving through every circle with a very clear, like, I have a mission of certain stuff I want to have happen. And the more, depending on where you're at with your own activity, you may not notice when someone's trying to push what you're doing in a way that benefits this other thing over here. You know what I mean? And that's where it gets, it's it's high times. It's an interesting time, but it's always been.
Yeah, it always has been, but I think because we have access now in ways that people didn't before. I would be remiss if we didn't really talk about this before we come to a close. But it is what you said, high time. But we have access to news, technology, and awareness of what's going on in some communities in a way we didn't before, and that's always a plus and a way we can use to our advantage. An example of that is how, so in Oregon is one of the most innovative, proactive voting systems in terms of trying to get everybody to vote. Basically, people are registered, at the driver's license level at this point now. Yeah. And so Oregon's innovative in that. Oregon could get away with it, and some would say even legislator might have crammed it down the other party's throat, which is a totally another discussion around what we mean around really engaging both parties on anything. But it's another part, a really important part of this discussion that we're not having yet. But the point I'm making is that everyone in a place like this, as we sit here in Oregon, might not necessarily know about voter suppression in places like Georgia. Mm-hmm. Be aware of what's happening in places that may not be the place that might immediately affect you, but it might affect your cousin who lives there. Mm-hmm. Might affect somebody else, and people who are in Georgia should all be registering to vote, and should way before an election, and should be checking if their registration is still in the system or not, and at incremental steps leading up to the election. Mm-hmm. I would even suggest every 6 months, checking in. Is your status still there? And it runs counter to some people who don't want to be a part of the system identified, but no, you should have ID. If you're someone who's elderly, there's still enough time to go out and be able to get, in terms of the next year's election, make sure you have some sort of ID. You can get ID. And at this point, and at a certain point, it doesn't take a lot to be able to get. But that's something that we need to shift in terms of our thinking about, people knowing who we are and that kind of thing. No, we need to engage on that.
Yeah. Some of us have to be. For me, and this is just speaking for myself, one of the things that I've accepted for my own role is that some of us have to be, even though we're not maybe not public figures in terms of like our role or our job, but we need to be public actors in terms of the needs of our community. Maybe not everybody, but we got to have a critical mass that are like, no, I'm at the meeting, or I filed the paperwork. Yep, that's my name. I live at that house. That's me. Yeah. Because it becomes also I live by the thing of like, what am I worried about? If they was coming to get me, they coming to get me. Yeah. If that's what we're worried about, if they're coming to get you, they're coming to get you. Yeah. And you might as well get ready for it. But that not being withstanding, we have to be active in public. We have to get engaged in public. Even part of this podcast is the hope to generate a conversation about how to be who we are in public in more ways than maybe the ways we feel comfortable showing up in public, right? And having people who have to wrestle with however they feel about whatever it is you're doing when you're in public, Yeah. I think it's vitally important to our communities. I think it's actually, there's a lot you can learn about how you move in the world, and then how people are responding to you, and then you might be like, oh snap, I didn't realize that. I didn't know people cared that much. Also, I didn't realize I had that kind of impact.
That's why engaging is important, and not because you learn those things through engagement, and it might. And some people are impacted by trauma and may not realize how some of their resistance for certain things are impacted by certain things, and it helps, like you said, to to awareness around, okay, that wasn't so bad, or this is actually good or actually healthy. This is good. People know, I had a positive impact on this person, and they saw my action informed them to do this, such and such.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Damon, I'm going to wrap us up because I don't want you to be late to where you got to get to next.
Really appreciate you.
What I'd
Thank
like
you
to do
for inviting me in a second time around.
Oh, you're welcome, man. I got more. I'd like to well, I'll probably offline. I got something to pitch you on, an idea, and maybe we can talk more regularly and see what that looks like. Anything that you would like to share just as a closing before I let us go?
As a closing point, to quote Dave Chappelle in his last special, I think that every common sense, moral-minded American, it was people of color, or it was particular black people, or well-meaning whites, need to go out and register for an armed weapon.
Absolutely.
That will change the dynamic of the gun debate overnight.
Absolutely. Damon Isiah Turner, thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
I appreciate you.
Appreciate you more, sir.
Peace. This has been the Ask Your Oldhead podcast with Justice Rajee. Peace.